Um, and now we're going live, so it'll just be silent for a few seconds, and then I'll do my intro, but have a great event.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Good evening, and welcome to tonight's live online author event with Greenlight Bookstore. I'm Katie from Greenlight, and we're thrilled to host tonight's event with Eric Dean Wilson, presenting his new book, After Cooling, on Freon, global warming, and the terrible cost of comfort. You'll be talking with Eula Biss, so you're in for an excellent time. Before we start, I just want to say a huge thanks to Eric, Eula, and the team at Simon & Schuster for making this happen, and to all of you for showing up. Though we're not able to host events in our store spaces, our community of authors and readers is still here. We're grateful for your support and for the chance to make space for conversation and connection. There's just a few housekeeping things to go over before we get started. In our Zoom webinar tonight, you can see and hear the speakers, but they can't see or hear you. We can see that you're here though, and you can see a count of fellow attendees at the top of your Zoom screen, but the exact location will depend on what kind of device you're using. There are a couple of ways that you can interact with the authors and with each other throughout tonight's event, which we highly encourage. The first is the chat, which you can find by clicking on the icon that looks like one speech balloon. You're welcome to post your comments and thoughts in the chat. It's a great way to show your appreciation for the author and to interact with fellow attendees. So if you have a specific question you'd like to have answered by the author, please post that in the Q&A module. You can find it by clicking on the icon that looks like two speech balloons. We'll be pulling questions only from the Q&A to be answered in the later part of the program, so please make sure you're putting them there and not in the chat. And importantly, tonight's featured book, After Cooling, is available for sale from Greenlight Bookstore. You can shop in person in our bookstore locations, 12 p.m. to 7 p.m. every day of the week, and you can purchase Eric's book and many others on site. Or you can order online at greenlightbookstore.com for a quick pickup at the store or for shipping anywhere in the US. I'll drop the buy link in the chat in just a moment. Eric is stopping by our store to sign copies of the book so you can get a signed or even personalized book by request while supplies last. Make sure to indicate your signed copy request in the order comments at checkout when ordering online, or look for signed copies when you visit the store. If you care about supporting the careers of authors and the ongoing existence of independent bookstores, buying tonight's featured book is a great way to show your support. Our interviewer tonight is Eula Biss. She is the author of 4 books, most recently, Having and Being Had. Her book, On Immunity, was named one of the 10 best books of 2014 by the New York Times Book Review, and Notes from No Man's Land won the National Book Critics Circle Award for Criticism in 2009. Her essays and prose poems have recently appeared in The Guardian, the New York Review of Books, The Believer, Freeman, Jubilat, and The Backlash, Harper's, and the New York Times Magazine. She teaches nonfiction writing at Northwestern University. She'll be speaking with our featured author and neighbor, Eric Dean Wilson. His essays, poems, and criticism have been published in the Los Angeles Review of Books and Tin House, among other publications. A former assistant editor at Archipelago Books and graduate of the New Schools MFA program, Wilson is currently a teaching fellow in the Mellon Seminar on Public Engagement and Collaborative Research through the Center for Humanities at the Graduate Center CUNY, through which he teaches climate-themed writing and environmental justice to undergraduates at Queens College. In addition to teaching, Wilson is also pursuing a PhD in the English program at the Graduate Center, where his work focuses on American studies, environmental humanities, activist writing, and the Black radical tradition. His new book, After Cooling, is an impactful work of literary nonfiction that interweaves the science and history of the powerful refrigerant and dangerous greenhouse gas, Freon, with a compelling meditation on how to live meaningfully and morally in a rapidly heating world. Eric is going to start us off with a reading from the book, and then he'll be talking with Eula and with all of you. Please take it away, Eric.
Thank you so much. Thank you to Greenlight for setting this up, and thank you to Simon & Schuster, everybody there. And thank you so much, Eula. It's so great to be in conversation with you. And hello, everyone. I see so many familiar names, old and new, and it's so exciting to see all those in the chat. I'm just going to read a very brief excerpt from the book. And to just set this up briefly, the book toggles between 2 modes. One is first-person narrative of going on a road trip with someone to find and buy up used Freon to destroy it. And then the other mode is a 3-part history of Freon: before Freon, the age of Freon, and after Freon. So I'm going to read just a little bit of the beginning of the age of Freon. Take a sip of water. The 1930 meeting of the American Chemical Society was hotly anticipated, even by the lady. The country's leading chemists had gathered in Atlanta's Biltmore, a colonnaded hotel topped with twin radio towers, cables strung between them as if to show how deeply connected, how acutely smaller, the world was becoming. After the 27th year in which the traders at 11 Broad had spent the summer in air-conditioned comfort, October had brought the crash of the stock market, that devastating tumble of 1929, which, after an unrestrained decade of motoring, must have felt as if the invisible hand were meting out some unintelligible punishment. The market had spoken, and the nation was thrown into a depression as moral as it was economic. But while devotion to the cult of progress weakened for some, faith in science and technology grew even stronger. The reign of its gods, a belief in their unique blessing on the United States of America, prevailed. Chemistry would save the Union, or it would not be saved. At the start of the conference, a day oddly chilly for April in Georgia, the chemists gathered around the stage in the main auditorium for the opening act, a scientific demonstration of sorts, but something more like prestidigitation. Thomas Midgley Jr., the 40-year-old inventor of the new miracle refrigerant, faced his audience from behind a table bearing 2 glass pails and an unlit candle. To begin, Midgley lit the candle. Gently, he set the flame inside one of the pails attached to a rubber tube. Making a show of it, he bent to blow into the tube. The flame wavered, but the candle continued to burn. Next, into the empty pail, he poured a supercooled, colorless liquid. As the air of the room enveloped it, the liquid began to boil, its spectacularly low condensing point an important part of its marvel. A white vapor, visible briefly, rose to frost the rim of the glass. Midgley, a flamboyant ham if nothing else, stuck his round face, made rounder by a pair of glasses with circular lens, into the vapor and inhaled for several seconds, sucking the opaque wisps of dichloro-difluoromethane into his lungs, what would look to us now like a massive bong hit. He straightened as if balancing the dollop of duck liver mousse that was his hair, grabbed the tube connected to the other pail, and exhaled. Now invisible, the refrigerant gas filled the glass pail and doused the flame, in the words of one reporter, as if pinched. Amazed, the conference room crackled with applause. For anyone who knew anything about industrial refrigerant, as the majority of the present audience of the 1930 ACS Atlanta conference surely did, that pinch was well worth a clap or two, if not a standing ovation. To them, Midgley's theatrics would have proved 2 things, but both startling at the time. First, the new refrigerant, unlike many of the so-called natural refrigerants before it, ammonia, methyl chloride, methyl bromide, butane, was non-flammable. In fact, the refrigerant smothered the flame, a characteristic that would later prompt Midgley to patent a related compound for use in fire extinguishers. And second, it was non-toxic, as proved by Midgley's big top breath. Previously, the best the industry could offer for indoor coolers had been sulfur dioxide because, though highly toxic, the refrigerant emitted a strong, musky stench that warned of a leakage, ruining the entirety of a fridge's contents in the process. Other refrigerants, the methyl group, were stealthier in their harm and so more dangerous. But now those dangers already seem difficult to recall as CFC-12, soon to be known as Freon, solved both quandaries at once. The next day, one newspaper underscored its safety: is neither poisonous nor explodes. When it arrived on the market in 1930, Freon was touted as totally safe, an innocuousness that was, given all available evidence, true, by a company that claimed to offer better living through chemistry. In fact, DuPont unfurled that slogan shortly after the success of Freon, and so the refrigerant came to symbolize all that modern science could offer the world: efficiency, consistency, technological progress, personal comfort, and above all, safety through control. It was the chemical of no external consequences. It was an avatar of modernism, much the same way the steam engine had propelled not only ships and machines, but the ideology that had driven the Industrial Revolution. The United States was getting somewhere, and Freon was the industrial proof. But its cost remained a question whose answer was uncertain and largely unasked. For Americans, the appearance of Freon, as if from nowhere, meant not only a safe refrigerant, but a safe world as well. Yet it would be an absurd misnomer to label safe or non-toxic a chemical that nearly ushered in the destruction of all life on this planet. As is true with so many environmental crises, the questions are those of scale. For whom was it safe? And for how long? The answer for the default American scale, that of the individual over one generation, a rather precarious scale on which to make decisions ever since the Fordist era, when industry gained the ability to multiply a single chemical at an unprecedented rate, looks very different from the scale of the collective health of a planetary community over several generations. The refrigerant, when inhaled, caused what Midgley called a sort of intoxication. Indeed, it did, even when not inhaled. Few chemicals not overseen by the Drug Enforcement Administration have caused such an addictive craze and transformation of the psyche, fueling, as they did, the world-altering project of air conditioning and refrigeration. The April 1930 Conference of Chemists was a resounding success. Images of a future made more efficient by science, a future faster in pace and undoubtedly safer, comforted a people still grappling with the uncertainty of the global economy. They would make it out of this mess, the chemists seemed to promise, by the use of their wits and the skills of their craft. Midgley was written up in all the major papers. Icy breath puts out candle like a wet blanket. And though the weather was chilly that Wednesday, the Atlanta heat would slowly creep in by the end of the week.
Thanks, Eric. I'm going to give a little clap for everyone. Thank you. That was lovely and got straight to some of the most compelling aspects of the book. This idea, this fantasy of a magic compound with no consequences, right? And but I also loved that you got straight to the idiosyncrasies and the strangeness that come up throughout the history of air conditioning. So this is one of the great pleasures for me. I'm going to hold up the book again so that people can see it. It's lovely. One of the great pleasures of reading this book for me was just getting to explore the strangeness and the quirkiness of this history that's full of eccentrics and eccentricities. But and one of the great surprises for me was that I guess I have to admit, I'd never thought about the history of air conditioning. It just never crossed my mind. But one of the great surprises was that when you're looking at the very early history, you reveal that it wasn't, it wasn't like the second this technology, that the ability to cool was discovered, that there was an instant run on it. It wasn't as desirable as we imagine now it might have been. And that to me was a really fascinating revelation. So I wondered if you could just talk a little bit about that early history of air conditioning and give us a little more insight into that moment.
Absolutely. And I think it's so interesting to hear you say that you hadn't thought about it before, because I absolutely hadn't either. And I think that's one of the things that is sort of lurking through this book, is this chemical and also this thing that's all around us. So many of us, including myself before I started this project, don't think of it at all. Mm-hmm. And so the book is kind of my attempt to just try to stay with the trouble, as Donna Haraway says. So yeah, I was surprised to find that that the history of air conditioning begins in the 1840s with a doctor who wanted to treat malaria in Florida, named Dr. John Gorey. And there had been Scottish scientists, British scientists, some American scientists through the end of the 18th century to the mid 19th century who felt like they knew how to cool mechanically, and were trying to do it more efficiently and harness it for some purpose. And the way you do that, by the way, is by expanding and contracting a liquid, or evaporating and condensing a liquid, which is exactly the same way you do it now. So Benjamin Franklin actually cooled with a bellows by evaporating liquid in a tube and putting a thermometer in there. And it's more or less the exact same way that your air conditioner in the home works. Same principles of physics. So John Gorey had this brilliant idea that in the Florida South, which was ravaged by malaria, you have to remember that at the time, we didn't know that malaria was connected to mosquitoes. So it killed thousands of people every year. It was horrible in the South. And Gorey wanted to cool the patients who had malaria fever, to ease them, not to cure the malaria, but hopefully to make them feel more comfortable. And so he tried lots of things, like a big block of ice with blowing on it, and he came up with this machine, which was essentially the first air conditioner. And it worked. It was like a size of sort of a room with what I imagine is sort of a car engine. It was very noisy. Used water as a refrigerant, and it really worked. And he also kind of accidentally discovered, made the first ice machine too, because he left it, actually a servant, houseboy, maybe a slave, unclear from history, actually left it on all night, and it produced a lot of ice. So Dr. Gorey, as we all might think, thought, oh my gosh, I am going to be a rich man. This is brilliant. He had this whole dream of cooling entire cities. He wrote this whole paper on air conditioning every city in America, climate controlling it, and this brilliant idea that by somehow climate controlling it, it would bring us all together as citizens, as communities. And he was really kind of a utopian thinker in this way. And he tried to get investors for it, and nobody was interested in it. No one. And this poor man, who was already kind of gloomy, died penniless of fever from malaria, the very thing he was trying to treat. And he had filed a patent for an ice machine, but his patent for the air conditioner was pending, and his wife, he died too soon, and his wife never sent the rest of the papers. So after 2 years, I think it was destroyed. And flash forward 50 years, and it's not really until half a century later when somebody was really in earnest trying to do that again, because nobody really wanted it. Uh-oh.
Sorry, was I frozen to you, Eric, or were you just frozen
for a second?
Okay,
yeah.
I just try to reset. Let me know if there's something. I think there's something a little bit dodgy going on with my connection right now, but I heard almost everything that you said except the very, very end. But that story, as I followed it in your book, it was agonizing to me. I really wanted to see this guy's ice machine catch on in his lifetime, because we all know what comes later, right? And we know how indispensable people seem to find this technology now. So it was excruciating, but also like really fascinating to see that there wasn't. It wasn't like every human on Earth was laying around dreaming about the possibility of the air in a room being cooled. It's
totally. And this is not to say that people weren't hot and suffered in the heat. And of course, like in the 1800s in the South, you had the added violence of enslavement. You had, Equiano, in his interesting narrative, talks about when he was a slave, being forced to fan the master of the plantation for cooling. So there was that aspect of it too. If you were white and a landowner, you didn't have to work. And at the same time, the fact that nobody wanted an air conditioner or wanted to invest in an air conditioner, they thought it was too weird, it was unhealthy, really gives us a little glimpse, and there are many of them in the history of air conditioning, that what we think of as an inevitability, as you just pointed out, is actually partially a construction. Yes, people have been hot, there have been horrible heat waves, people have died in heat-related events throughout the history of civilization, but what we knew then, which we don't know now, was how to mitigate the heat, how to really deal with that. And one of the exciting things that I found in this history was that a lot of the history points to idea of how to weather the heat collectively. Like in New York City in the 40s, I just saw somebody posted something, an article today about it with pictures from the 40s of people in tenement houses sleeping on the fire escape or on the roofs, sleeping under the stars in the park, which nobody would ever do now, willingly maybe. But people found ways to collectively cool. And now we just don't really think about it. We just, it's the techno fix. We just push on a button and we don't have to think about it. And we could do it individually. We don't need each other, which I think is one of the weird, unforeseen consequences of air conditioning.
Yeah. I have great memories from when I was a kid and we didn't have air conditioning, and all four of us kids slept on the back porch when it was hot, and it was fun. And I thought of that recently when I went to a writer's residency that was in an old estate building where every bedroom had a sleeping porch. And that's what the sleeping porches were for, is for when it was really hot out. That's where you would sleep to stay comfortable.
Absolutely.
So Dr. Gorey was, he's one of the first people we encounter in your book, the person who accidentally invented a nice machine. But you go on to introduce us to so many interesting characters and eccentrics. And I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about the inventor of Freon, who has a really central role in this story.
Totally. The inventor of Freon was a man named Thomas Midgley Jr. That I read just a little bit about in the opening selection earlier. And he is one of the quirkiest historical figures I've come across. And he is famous for two things. One is the inventor of Freon, and the other is the inventor of leaded gasoline. So this guy was a real winner. And there's a historian, John R. McNeil, he's an environmental historian, and he made the startling claim that no other single organism on the planet, including cyanobacteria that made oxygen on the planet in the Earth's very early days, he's claimed that no other single organism had more of an impact on the atmosphere of the Earth than Thomas Midgley Jr. Wow. And bad impact, to be clear. And the reason is that his inventions came very close to destroying the ozone layer, without which we cannot survive. Not just us, any life, really, pretty much. And leaded gasoline, as we all know, maybe not younger generations, but so I'll say that leaded gasoline is very bad. It used to be in just about every car until it started to get phased out in the early 70s. It took about 20 years, and then by the 90s it was phased out. And one of the most haunting things I found was a suggestion. There's a growing body of research well, let me back up for a second. There's a huge question of why crime increased in the 70s and 80s and then dropped abruptly. The dominant narrative, which is not true, is that crime went up and up and up, and then we increased policing and prisons, and we cracked down on crime, and then crime went down. That's not what happened. And Ruth Wilson Gilmore shows this really well in her book, Golden Gulag, in terms of just California. What actually happened was a lot weirder, which was that crime increased, and then it dropped significantly, and then the policing increased and prisons increased. So lots of people have tried to understand why this rise in crime and why this drop in it. And one of the weirdest things that I found, which a study that has been corroborated actually across the whole industrialized world, everywhere there was leaded gasoline, is that with an appropriate lag effect, the rise in crime mirrors the rise in leaded gasoline fumes. And the effects of concentrated leaded gasoline is things like violent behavior. So, it's really hard to prove that causation. Correlation is not causation, but the numbers are quite convincing, and certainly it had some factor in urban areas. So that's sort of the legacy of Midgley. He didn't really see any of the danger to Freon in his lifetime. We didn't discover that Freon was bad for the atmosphere until the 70s, and he died in 45. But he definitely, there was some cognitive dissonance going on with the leaded gasoline. I mean, it was controversial even before it went on the market. There was a famous story where the reporters showed up at his office asking whether he was poisoning the air. And in order to assure the reporters, knowing that it was poisonous, he dunked his hands in the leaded gasoline and washed his hands and face with it, and said, "See, it's fine." And then after they left, he furiously scrubbed it off, like Lady Macbeth, trying to get the blood off. So there was some kind of cognitive dissonance going on there. But the ultimate sort of maybe weird part of the story is that he wasn't trained as a chemical engineer, which maybe that's why he didn't foresee any of these. He was trained as a mechanical engineer, and he towards the end of his life, he contracted polio just before the vaccine was created. And funny enough, his cooling would come to be very important for keeping the vaccine cool, the polio vaccine cool. He contracted polio and lost the mobility in his legs. And because he was a very independent person, he had a partner, but I imagine that he wanted to be as independent as he could. So he built this pulley system to move him from the wheelchair to the bed without anyone's help. So he's a mechanical engineer. And then one day his wife walked in on the bedroom and he was strangled from the cords of the pulley system. And for years they had reported it as an accident. But the coroner's report said that it was not an accident. So he had quite a bizarre, complex life. And one of the things I do in the book is not just to tell that story, but also reflect on how historians before Freon painted his death as some kind of tragedy. And then historians right after it painted it as, oh, this man got exactly what he deserved. Without forgiving maybe his cognitive dissonance on leaded gasoline, I find that kind of, oh, he got exactly what he deserved, quite cruel, actually, because I think what it brings up is the really complexity of all of our legacies. Each of us hopefully will leave the world with something, and hopefully that's leaving the world better. But how that's received by history is not something that we can control. And I guess I'm sort of haunted by that idea as I was reading about him and trying to tell his story. I guess on a selfish level, because I don't want to be villainized after my death, but also I think that's the case for all of us, and a lot of what this book and when we try to really think about environmental crises, what that comes down to is sort of like how do we want to shape the world in the present, but also for those after we're gone. What kind of legacy do we want to live?
Yeah, there's also, I mean, both of these stories, Eric, make me think of, they just impress on me how very short the span of a life is when we're thinking about the scope of human knowledge. So you don't get to know when you invent an ice machine what will come in the future, and nor when you bring Freon and leaded gasoline into use can you see where human knowledge is going to go later. There's a real like lesson in humility there. So I am trying to be aware of time here, and there's already two very interesting questions in the Q&A. And I just want to encourage folks who do have questions to put them in the Q&A, not in the chat, but in the Q&A function. And pretty soon, Eric, I'm going to circle around to that because these questions are really substantive and it might take a bit of time. But I do want to say that, this is a really special event for me because this is the first time that I've had the opportunity to celebrate a book written by a student of mine, a former student of mine. So Eric was I was Eric's thesis advisor 12 years ago for a senior thesis in creative writing at Northwestern, which actually bore certain like fascinating similarities to this book. Like this book, there was a road trip element to your thesis.
Right.
You actually
That's right.
you got an undergraduate grant from the university, which I thought was a real coup. When I saw your proposal that you wanted to go on a road trip and visit amusement parks all over the country, I was like, let's see what the university says to this. And incredibly, they gave you money
They
to
went
go on
for
a
it.
road trip.
I got money to go on roller coasters and carousels around the country.
Yeah, so so I was delighted for many reasons to see that there's a road trip in this book as well, that you've stuck with the road trip in your development as a writer and a thinker. But can you talk a little bit about that road trip element, but also, you've already very elegantly outlined the structure of the book, where you have this 3-part history of Freon, but you're moving back and forth between this deep history, and a contemporary moment. And quite a bit of that contemporary moment takes place in this road trip. And I'm, as a writer, interested in how you came to that, and the decisions that led you there. The book actually does not begin in the history; it begins in the moment of the now of our lives.
Totally. I knew, even before I knew that I wanted to write this book, that I wanted to write about climate change, and that I wanted to write about it in a way that wasn't totally doom and gloom. And as I started working on it, there were more and more books that came out that were apocalyptic, that were filled with shame and guilt. And I just don't think aesthetically that works, or that it's actually really useful. I think that people shut off, including myself. And if I, who care about these sorts of things, shut off, then good luck with anybody else. So I knew that I wanted to thread all this thinking through me, not to center myself necessarily, but to have a relatable person. and somebody who's messy and not the best environmentalist, and etc., meaning me. So somebody who's actually grappling with all of these things, because I thought that it might be great for a reader to have that avatar. So I this project began with a conversation with Sam Schiller, who is here, I believe, and also Rebecca Stevens, and long friends of mine. And Rebecca had told me, "Oh, you need to talk to Sam and his work, talk about his work, because it's really interesting and weird. He meets all these really weird people." So talking with Sam, he told me what he did, which was he was working for a green energy startup at the time, to go around and find Freon that was on the secondary market, it's being bought and sold on the secondary market, and destroy it kind of secretly for carbon credits. And a lot of the people that he met were people who are villainized by the environmental left. People who are sometimes global warming deniers. They outright don't like what they call the carbon guys, this sort of thing. And so I quickly realized that aside from the literal work that Sam was doing, he was actually having conversations with people across deep ideological divides. I wanted to write a profile of Sam. And then right after I started working on this, Trump was elected, and suddenly the only thing we heard was America is divided, over and over and over again. And so I knew that this was actually a really great way to talk about not necessarily like one person who's saving the world, which is not what it is, but to talk about one person who's actually talking to people with views that that he's deeply opposed to, but also making connections, and in some cases able to forge trusting relationships with, and sometimes change their mind a little bit, sometimes a lot. And I find that really inspiring and messy in all of these interesting ways. And so Rebecca had suggested that that I go on one of these excursions with him. So I happened to be in Memphis visiting my family at the time, and they came down and we rented a car, and we drove just one day from Memphis to New Orleans. We were going down there for the new year, and we made as many Freon pickups as we could. And even just in one day, I saw such a wide spectrum of types of people that he was buying this from, and they were all just like complete characters. So I knew I wanted to write about them, and I sort of started there even before I went down into the history of Freon. But it was all right there. It was the working class, middle class divide, hostility to environmentalism. There was a lot of talk of Hurricane Katrina. So even though they didn't use the words climate change, the wake of Hurricane Katrina was so present in Louisiana. Some of them made overtly racist comments. So this kind of like the idea of air conditioning and the history of systemic racism were also very present in that road trip. And I thought for a little while that maybe it was a coincidence. And then as I began to read and research more of the history of air conditioning, I realized, oh, this is not a coincidence at all. Actually, it's about who gets to be comfortable and who doesn't, and who gets to live and who doesn't. It became even more about environmental justice for me. So, and I also just felt like it would be, rather than a straightforward history book, having that road trip would give it some quite literal momentum. Even though it sort of took place all in one day, it's sort of spread out. And I try to ground the reader in in my experience, which I think is possibly more relatable than a voice from the beyond narrating some kind of history. It's the kind of history I like to read. So that's, I guess, why I chose to read it like that.
Yeah, I think one of the great achievements of this book is the way that you, from the very beginning, illustrate how the history of air conditioning intersects with the history of racism, the history of eugenics, the history of all kinds of power relationships, actually, within this country, within the world. And one of the things that you circle back to again and again, especially as you're talking about the development of various technologies, is the role of capitalism in as a player, as a driving force behind both climate change and the place that these technologies have in our everyday lives. And this was something that you and I were talking about as we were both writing books at the same time. I was writing a book about the everyday experience of capitalism, the lived experience of capitalism, I guess is how I would describe it. And as I was writing this book and talking to you over emails, sending letters, you were writing this book about air conditioning. And I do remember a moment from our correspondence where you said that the more you learned, the more you felt that this problem, meaning the problem, the environmental problem of us destroying our own world, was not going to be surmountable until we did away with capitalism. Essentially, it's like that you were seeing capitalism as one of the central driving forces, and that was extremely fascinating to me. And if you are up for this, I will read the moment from my book where there's a bit of a cameo. Where so this is from my book, Having and Being Had, and this moment comes from a note that Eric sent to me about visiting the New York Stock Exchange. And the whole book is built around exchanges and conversations with other people. And so this is the moment where in exchange with Eric, I see something that I haven't seen before. There's a statue of a woman with her arms outstretched on the front of the New York Stock Exchange, Eric tells me. The title of this statue is Integrity Protecting the Works of Man. Eric was my student many years ago, and now he's writing a book about air conditioning, which is really a book about how our comfort is destroying our world. The more comfortable we are, research suggests, the more destruction we're likely to be causing. No matter how much you care about the world, no matter how conscious you are, the best predictor of your impact on the environment is your income. The first complete working air conditioning system was installed in the New York Stock Exchange, which is what gave Eric an excuse to ask for a tour of the trading floor. At first, his request was denied, too much of a security risk, but he tried again. Granted access and cleared by security, he was met by a historian who guided him down a series of corridors and stairs to the main trading floor. They talked about air conditioning, so it was hard to avoid talking about politics. Air conditioning, Eric tells me, is always political. Air conditioning is where the economist Mariana Mazzucato turned her attention when she was among a group of experts advising the United Nations on sustainability. They were meeting in an overcooled room, so she asked for the air conditioning to be turned off. How can we hope to change anything, she asked, if we don't rebel in the everyday? The way we think about value is one of the things Mazzucato would like to change. Our understanding of value, she observes, is circular. Incomes are justified by the production of something that is of value. But how do we measure value? By whether it earns income. And so the concept of unearned income vanishes. If we could think about value differently, we could modify our economic system so that something of value to our entire society, like the well-being of our children or the preservation of our environment, would also have economic value. Investment is essential, she argues, but we need to ask, what are we investing in? The historian led Eric to a roped-off area and told him to stay within it. The trading floor was filled with men. The countdown to the bell began. It was a round, flat bell, like the fire alarm bells in public schools, but it was gold. Eric's view was blocked, so he could only see the bell, but not the hand that rang it. It was, he tells me, the invisible hand of capitalism. The bell rang and it kept ringing. The only thing that like it that he had ever experienced was the solar eclipse. The world went dark, crickets chirped, birds panicked. People around him were clapping and laughing. Tears came to his eyes, which embarrassed him, but nobody noticed. They were all looking at their phones. And this is how he got out of the stock exchange without being discovered as a spy.
It's such a beautiful excerpt. And speaking of economy, your economy of language is just something that I aspire to. It's
well,
gorgeous.
that one, as you know, was largely lifted from you, Eric. It's mere plagiarism. But I did want to read that moment, not just to underscore kind of the role of collaboration and conversation and all of this, which you come back to again and again in your book, the role of the collective, the cooperative in solving this problem, but also to highlight your thinking on the economic system behind this. And there is a question from the audience that is related to this. So this is from Olivia Wood, who says, "Hi, Eric. You've talked in other places about cooling's relationship with other points, places in history, like the stock exchange and government buildings. But do you have any thoughts about cooling and computing, the cooling needs of big data centers and so on?"
Hi, Olivia. Such a good question. And I had a section in it a little bit more about cooling of data centers, and the book was already too long and I took it out. The real question is, I'm not sure, but you're totally right that one of the huge unanswered questions is the energy and cooling needed to send information. I mean, what we think of right now as it's definitely digital, but what we don't think of as physical actually is physical. We're able to see each other through Zoom right now because some physical data center is processing and holding this information. I clearly don't have the language to explain this very well. It's so mysterious to most of us that it's difficult for us to describe what's actually happening. But it's not magic. There's a material presence on that. And you're right. I think we have to think about that better, because if we're going to really solve or address the environmental crises, we have to start thinking about carbon neutral internet and carbon neutral digital spaces. I do know that I think Google cools most, if not all, their data centers with water, which is great. As you probably already know, Bitcoin is terrible for lots of reasons, but it's terrible because it uses an unbelievable amount of or produces an unbelievable amount of global warming emissions through cooling its data servers alone. And so the use of Bitcoin and the rise of Bitcoin is very closely connected with global warming in this way that's terrifying. And I think it's even more terrifying because it's hard to picture that. It's hard to image it. And as I think we're discovering through the climate crisis right now, it's really hard to act on something when we don't have a clear image for it. That was one of the kind of lucky things about the ozone crisis, is that journalists started calling it the ozone hole. It's not really a hole, but you could picture a giant hole in the sky. And it was like something out of some kind of like surrealist nightmare. And it really galvanized not just the public, but political leaders and scientists to act to close that hole. Again, it was just kind of a made up image, but I'm not sure that the climate crisis has its version of the whole. So yeah, I'm just sort of rambling about the complexities that you sort out, but you're totally right on.
It's a really good point. Before this event started, Eric, you and I were, we were talking about you not having air conditioning. You have a fan on, and I was like, oh, I'll break out my hand fan, but we were thinking about what was going on within your living space and my living space, but we weren't thinking about what was going on behind the infrastructure that connects us to each other here. And it's a great point. So there's another really interesting question from Laura Rusella. Eric, at what point during your work on this project did you make the connection between the myth of the closed system of cooling and the myth of the individual?
Such a great question. Hi, Laura. Well, I think one of the things I knew that I wanted to talk about the kind of psyche of the contemporary American, if I can speak so broadly about something that's not so neat. I'm obviously very critical of American culture in this way. I know that not all of the world's problems stem from the United States, but as somebody who is an American, I feel like it's my duty to critique America. So I knew that I had wanted to talk about the kind of particular way in which American culture privileges independence and so-called freedom above the reality of interdependence and contingency. And I wasn't quite sure how to do that. And really just reading and watching a bunch of YouTube videos from very boring HVAC engineers. They're very helpful, but very boring HVAC engineers explaining how an air conditioner works. I noticed that phrase coming up over and over again, which is a phrase of just a kind of rote phrase in physics, the closed system. And then I happened to come across a study by Isabel Stengers, who's a philosopher, where she talks about that there actually is no such thing as a closed system. It's ever. I mean, we think of the United States, we think of the Earth. Well, we also think of the United States as a closed system, but we think of the Earth as a closed system, but it's absolutely not. You have energy from and radiation from the sun. Otherwise, life would not be possible on the Earth. So there's really only one system, and it's the universe, and that's the closed system. So, closed systems are only closed momentarily or for a short amount of time, and then they open up for another reason. So if you believe in a closed system, you are only looking at a small window of time when actually it's only closed for a moment, and even then imperfectly. So I kind of just liked the phrase at first. I was like, I like this idea of a closed system. And then I realized that those two ideas were connected. I was trying to talk about this kind of extreme individualism. And then here I was trying to describe how an air conditioner works. And there was sort of this perfect phrase, the closed system. And that, a lot of our culture teaches us that we are self-perpetuating closed systems. And it's just not true at all, by any stretch of the imagination. And part of, I think, our ecological challenge, culturally, at least psychologically, is to think of ways that we can really bust that myth of the closed system, which the United States is particularly apt to believe in. And I think this was, this myth was blown wide open during the pandemic. We saw that we were quite literally breathing each other's molecules all over the world. A virus that starts in China months later sweeps across the entire planet. If that's not a model for an open system, I don't know what is. And so that,
It's so
yeah.
interesting that you say that, Eric, because that came up, this same kind of thinking around the closed system came up when I was researching vaccination. But this is pre-pandemic. This is like 10 years ago. And one of the things I ran into was a fantasy that I think I sometimes indulged in myself, but that various parents that I was in conversation with would kind of fantasize of their own families as a kind of closed system, so
Yeah.
this idea that it doesn't, so long as your child is well cared for and well fed, it doesn't matter whether they're vaccinated or not, because it's, you're caring for them within this imaginary closed system of the household, which is, of course, we now see that that's blown apart for us really dramatically. But in 10 years ago, it still seemed like a fairly seductive fantasy for folks to indulge in.
Totally. And I find that really inspiring, because on that idea exactly, we often think about environmentalism or even public health as like, oh, I have to do a solid for my neighbor, or I have to,
Yeah.
I have to get over myself and do something selfless for someone else, and sacrifice something. But I actually don't think that that's what it is. It's actually just self-preservation. We don't have to be selfless. I'm not knocking that as a value, but we don't have to be, we don't have to sacrifice anything. It's actually just um, uh, it's actually just reasonable. In order to save ourselves, we have to save everybody, because we are all connected. It doesn't take some act of great altruistic strength. And I really believe in that. And I think that that's actually quite a freeing thing, when we can be released from the guilt and burden of being this kind of, better than thou environmentalist or what have you. It's not necessary.
Yeah, it's really interesting that this comes up around both public health and environmental issues, this idea that the interests of the individual must be pitted against the interests of the collective. And so I ran into that a lot with vaccination, this idea that what is good for the community can't possibly be good for the individual. They must be at odds. But with vaccination, it's very, there's all kinds of ways that it's been illustrated that actually your interests as an individual are very much aligned with the good of the community. And it's at some point, some researchers at Harvard they used game theory to study whether a purely self-interested individual would have enough motivation to vaccinate, and this was against influenza, right? So there's some complexities to the influenza vaccine, because it's not the most effective vaccine we have, and nor is it the most dangerous disease that we vaccinate against. So they're taking a fairly complex situation and trying to see, okay, what does a purely self-interested person do? And once they ran it through their whatevers, which I don't understand, what came out the other side was a purely self-interested person would vaccinate. So it's like, it's
Amazing.
Still, you can serve both things. But this comes up in your book. I was actually just looking at, I think I marked a sentence that was halfway through today. You're talking about this a television fight, which I won't go into, but it's the philosophical place that it takes you to, that is really about this question of do is our own personal desires at odds with the needs of our community, and so you tackle that in here, but I'd love to hear you take one last stab at it as our as our closing overture here.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, I think that we could, one of the things I try to call for in the book is not, a denial of what we want, but trying to ask us, do we want actually? And let's go for that. Like, why isn't environmentalism, why isn't a mainstream environmentalism about pursuing what we want and maybe even pleasure, by which I don't necessarily mean hedonism, although I'm all for that, but that if we actually um, the kind of comfort that we've been pursuing has gotten us to this world that is literally on fire. Um, is that really what we want? And um, and the we there is messy. Who is we in this instance? I know that, but I also think that a lot of people who aren't corporate executives are not sure that they really um, are not clear about what kind of world that they want, because they're afraid of losing uh, autonomy um, in the sort of way that you sketched out. They're afraid that the health of the community, however we define that, might be at odds with their own personal desires. But what I'm really asking is, like, I think that we can actually align a better world and our own pleasures that we're seeking um, with the planet and with each other. And because um, our definition of comfort and what we have come to believe that we want is not like it springs up randomly from us. These are things that are driven by corporate advertising, by culture, by our parents, by friends, by all these complex influences that aren't us or how we might define as us. They're defined by the collective. They're constructed. So, which doesn't mean that they're not real, but it does mean that they can shift if they have to, and they have to. So, that's kind of one of the major open questions that I'm really asking. It's like, how do we really non-coercively shift our desires to align with a future for all of us and a more equitable future for all of us?
Yeah, that's a beautiful way of putting it. And for me, this was one of the gifts of your book, was that it very much invited me to question a number of givens, a number of common assumptions, and I feel like one of those givens, or one of those common assumptions, is this this assumption that air conditioning makes us more comfortable. I mean, that alone, I actually think when I think about my daily life, it's, there's times that air conditioning has made me more comfortable, but I have a lot of very vivid memories of being highly uncomfortable in over air conditioned spaces. I think that's why that, the quote from that economist who was talking about turning off the air conditioning in the lecture hall before they could go on with their discussion really spoke to me, because again and again, I've found myself in institutional spaces where there's no thermostat. There seems to be no way to turn this off, and everyone's too cold. So it's like, I think we also need to acknowledge that this is not always making us more comfortable. Sometimes it's making us less comfortable.
Exactly. Beautifully put.
Eric, we're almost done here, but I see that there's one last question. So it would be wonderful for us to land on a question from the audience. And speaking of the audience, I just want to say a hello to all my many loved students who I have seen out there in the participants. It's so great to see your names here. And this question comes from Rebecca Stevens. In the book, you reflect on writing from the specific time frame of being in the pandemic in 2020, but the book was also researched and written over many years, maybe 6. How did the pandemic shift your understanding of this book and what you were up to in writing it?
Yeah. Hi, Rebecca. In some ways, it kind of underscored a lot of the things that I was already writing about, how I was writing so much about how air conditioning often falls along class and race lines. And so a lot of the techno fixes to things exacerbate inequality. And when the pandemic hit, we saw this happen in a very different way, right? It wasn't that everyone was getting sick equally. It was that if you had access to good healthcare in the industrialized world, you had a much better chance of getting through it. And then when the vaccine started rolling out, I started hearing that they had to be kept refrigerated. There were, of course, in the United States, two early vaccines approved. There was Moderna, which the vaccine just had to be refrigerated and under normal circumstances, which is pretty easy for a lot of places to do. Certainly in the United States, it's very easy. But Pfizer was different. It had to be cooled at like negative 97 degrees Fahrenheit. There were only like special labs or university centers in the United States and the developed world, so-called developed world, overdeveloped world. It virtually shut it out of less industrialized countries. And so one thing I write about in the book, and also thinking about Eula's work, was that the ability to cool, super cool, was also granted access to immunity. So it quite literally, even without being in a heat wave, meant access to vaccines and saving lives. And we're still seeing that. So that really, it wasn't totally a shock when it came, but it helped me really think about all these ways that a technology, which seems like a good for everybody, actually filters down along the unequal lines that are already distributed unevenly. And how if we're going to actually address problems of planetary health, we have to address issues of global inequity. And it's really a global problem. Yeah.
Thank you, Eric. That was terrific and a super relevant place to end. I'm just absolutely delighted to be here talking with you 12 years after we first worked together and celebrating this book. And I highly recommend that you all pick it up if you haven't read it already. And yes, bravo, Eric. This is terrific.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Eula, and thank you, Greenlight. Thank you, everyone, for coming. It's so wonderful.
Thank you both so much for that fantastic discussion, and thanks everybody for joining us. Don't forget to buy your copy of After Cooling in-store or online at greenlightbookstore.com. Thanks so much, everybody. Have a great night.
Thank you.
Good night.